I'm being reminded that I'm being recorded, so that's cool. Before I get started, I have to say that in over 50 years, I have never given a lecture sitting down. And so if I bounce out of my chair and start pacing, you'll understand why. This is a new experience for me to talk and sit simultaneously. We'll see how that goes. I came up with this talk partly because for a long time I've been interested in aggressive behavior, but also child maltreatment, and looking for points of intersection between the two. And one of the things that, although Tracy has pointed out that we're doing work that improves the lives of people, it seems to me that we're actually moving at glacial speed on some fronts. And so some of the thoughts that I have and caused me to consider some of the work that I'll be describing today, in part has to do with what I think is slow movement. Oh, I got to get this thing to move, don't I? I've never actually done this
You
before.
should be able to just press the arrow down on your computer or the space bar, and that usually gets it moving.
Well,
There you go.
oh, okay.
Okay.
Maybe I jumped too far. That doesn't matter. So one of the things that I'm going to try and bring along here today are three somewhat intersecting themes. One of them is, how do we define maltreatment? And a corollary of that, do our research subjects view our criteria for maltreatment the same way we do? I also want to address questions regarding self-report, primarily in the context of histories of abuse. And then I want to revisit a consideration of the contribution of targets to circumstances of maltreatment. Now, I want to emphasize that I'm not talking about victim blaming here. I'm really talking about the degree to which there are risk factors that might be a contributing consideration. So a little bit of my background. I started doing research in the 1960s on induced aggression with non-human subjects. So I cut my teeth as an animal researcher. And a lot of what I've done since then is kind of influenced by how people conduct non-human research. We can't give non-humans a questionnaire. We can't ask them about their thoughts and intentions. So it gets us thinking about in a different way. I moved from induced aggression to so-called naturally occurring agonistic behavior. And I started conducting research on early developmental influences on adult aggression in rodents and avians. And then I had a serendipitous event. I was asked to review a grant application from my late colleague, Jerry Solomons, who was in the Department of Pediatrics. And I was reading his grant application, and I was impressed by the fact that some of the things that I was doing with young rats would map nicely onto considerations of physical abuse of children. So that's how I started to slide into child maltreatment. Now, in 1978, I wrote a paper, Child Abuse as an Area of Aggression Research. I published it in Pediatric Psychology. It was a colossal failure. I never got a reprint request. I don't think it's ever been cited. I don't think anybody's ever read the paper. But I was thinking about how aggression and physical abuse of children might blend together. So what I'm doing today is to look at just a few apparent parallels in research, a few points of intersection, and I'm hoping that we might see the fact that there are some connections between child abuse research and aggression research. Now, one of the things that's influenced me a great deal are various taxonomies of aggression that were advanced. And here's a long list of, well, a whole bunch of former ISRA members. Keck Moyer was the first editor of aggressive behavior. Paul Brain has been a longtime contributor. Cy Feshbach, Glenn Berkowitz, Kirsty Lagerspitz and Kai Borkvist, Adrian Rain and Dodge, and then of course Nate Azrin and Ron Hutchinson. In the history of aggression research, we have different models of aggression that are based on the presentation of the behavior, putative physiological substrates, standards of performance, target characteristics. There's just a whole constellation. Now, among these, instrumental aggression and hostile aggression like Cy Feshbach, instrumental aggression and emotional aggression like Glenn Berkowitz, direct and indirect aggression, Kirsty Lagerspitz and Kai Borkvist, proactive and reactive aggression, and also instrumental and pain-induced aggression. All of those kind of relate to how we might think about parenting and physically abusive behavior directed towards children. Now, one of the things that we often find ourselves doing is attempting to understand the intention of the adult party in an aggressive encounter or an abusive encounter. I have no idea how many abusive parents I have interviewed over the course of my career. I have never talked to a parent that expressed malevolent intentions toward the child. They want the kid to behave better in school. They want them to behave better in other contexts. There's all kinds of socially desirable reasons. And I've argued that we really can't unequivocally assess the intentions. Sometimes we define abuse in terms of specific acts, specific kinds of acts that a parent might display towards a child, blows being struck, strategies. Sometimes it's defined in terms of the consequences, such as tissue damage. Sometimes we put caveats on acts. So striking a child with a belt might be abusive in some context, but only if it produces tissue damage in another context. Considerations of severity of injury. So bruising might be considered abusive in some jurisdictions, but not in others. There's also a detection standard. That's one of the reasons why some people like to use non-accidental injurious death, because they're always recorded. You never miss a non-accidental injurious death. And then child abuse is different than aggression research because we often are forced into using archival evidence. There are a couple of unique things that set child abuse apart from the kind of aggression research that we usually do. One of them is we have criteria that are typically specified in child protective statutes. And then related to that, there's jurisdictional differences. So the standards in the US in some states are different than other states. Some states provide statutory support for corporal punishment. Other states put prohibitions on corporal punishment. Some states have statutory support for religious exemptions in parenting. So abuse and neglect standards in Indiana in the US is different than, say, Iowa or Illinois. Anyway, as I have suggested a few minutes ago, I believe that irritable and instrumental aggression, proactive and reactive aggression, and direct and indirect aggression can be considered in the context of parenting in a discipline-mediated model of physical abuse. Now, indirect aggression would tend to get subsumed under emotional abuse, which is represented in a lot of statutes, but as I do not know of a single instance of it being recorded in child abuse registries in the absence of either care neglect or physical abuse. So you have a co-occurrence there. So you can think about indirect aggression in the context of parenting, but it will co-vary with direct aggression. And one of the things that we've done over the years is we've collected a lot of data on self-reports of physical abuse. And there's a lot of advantages of that. One of them is it's cheap, it's convenient, it's replicable, and sometimes it's the only way we can get access to experiences that people personally have had in their childhood. So we've used, and I'm going to describe a whole constellation of some findings using a questionnaire called the Assessing Environments. It provides data on self-reports of punitive childhood experiences, and all the data that I'm going to be talking about largely come from what Finkelhor and Brown referred to as natural collectivities. So the subjects are brought together for reasons other than child maltreatment, so that you don't get a contaminated estimate of prevalence. And we have literally got data from thousands of undergraduates from Iowa, Wisconsin, Florida, Oregon, Michigan, and also clinical samples that were collected for reasons other than child maltreatment. Adolescents in out-of-home placements, adult adoptees, women at an antepartum clinic, incarcerated felons, adults with craniofacial anomalies, ADHD. So a broad range of people provided us data on their childhood histories. And what we're interested in is both injurious and non-injurious, commonly reported ways that children are disciplined, either by blows being struck or physical restraint. And it includes such things as I was struck by coat hangers, I was struck with a belt buckle, my parents used a belt to discipline me, paddles, switches, hot objects, being burned by cigarettes, which is an old item. We might not have that these days. Sorry. And then requiring medical care because of the discipline of their parents, being hospitalized, requiring sutures, requiring a cast because of discipline. And then various forms of injuries because of disciplinary acts, bruising, cuts, fractures, dental injuries, head injuries. Now, how do these things get subsumed under a criterion for abuse? Some of you might remember conversations with Murray Strauss. In 1980, he argued in a number of contexts, including congressional testimony, about a standard that he would apply that would describe physical abuse of children. Murray didn't like any blows being struck. So it turns out in all of the various samples that we have studied, the thousands of subjects, roughly 47 to 65% of the people describe experiences that Murray Strauss would have said was physically abusive. There was a study done by Sapp and Carter in Texas where they surveyed a random sample of Texans as to what constitutes a physically abusive act. Texans describe striking a child with a belt as non-abusive, striking with a belt buckle as abusive, striking with a paddle, not abusive, striking with a coat hanger, abusive. So with these idiosyncrasies, we look at the data of all these thousands of subjects, and depending on the sample, 23 to 32% of undergraduates, incarcerated felons, people in out-of-home placements, they're describing having experienced the same standards as the Sapp and Carter people. And then Audrey Berger proposed a standard that required injurious events, physically injurious events, and a large number. She proposed 8 different objects. 8 to 12% of the samples met Audrey Berger's criterion for having been physically abused. But these people don't describe themselves as being abused. And this is what I was reminded of this with Barbara Craig's talk in terms of women who failed to describe their assaultive experiences as assault. Young adults and adolescents who meet various criteria for having been abused, few of them self-label their experiences as abusive. Only a quarter of the subjects that meet Audrey Berger's rigid criteria describe themselves as abused. Only 8.5 to 12%, depending on the sample, meet the Sapp and Carter and describe themselves. So why do they do that? We even had 25% of a sample that were in out-of-home placement because of abuse describe themselves as having been abused. It's not protecting the family because they can describe sibling experiences that have exactly the same. They describe their siblings as having had exactly the same punitive disciplinary experiences. They're 2 to 3 times as likely to describe a sibling as having been abused as their own personal experiences as constituting abuse. Injury dramatically increases the labeling, but one of the critical factors is an expression of deserving. If you feel like you deserve the discipline, you're much less likely to describe it as abusive. And I spent a lot of time and a fair amount of money trying to identify social desirability influences. We assume that people are trying to describe themselves in a socially desirable fashion, but that assumes that they understand what constitutes social desirability. Marlowe Crown, MMPI, LNK, none of the strategies that I used for standardized measures to assess social desirability predict whether or not people label themselves as having been abused. This is one of my favorite findings. I think of physical discipline as a superordinate category in which spanking is a member. Roughly 85% of US samples describe themselves as having been spanked. Less than half describe themselves as having been physically abused or physically disciplined. So it's like spanking is a category off to itself. One of the problems with self-report is whether or not people are actually describing events that occurred. We did a study, and it was embedded in the Oregon Youth Study. I collaborated with Jerry Patterson and John Reed on this. We got self-report measures from young adults who had been observed during childhood in their homes. so we could look at whether or not directly observed behaviors between parents and children actually were represented in the self-reports. The physical discipline scores correlated highly with total aversive behavior scores that were actually coded, which suggests veridicality with the report. But it only applied to objectively scored measures, descriptors of events, not perceptions. Oh, I should mention here, father data don't correlate, but that's because the fathers were switching all the time. It's hard to get good data on fathers. I can say this because I'm a father, but we tend to be kind of unreliable in sources of data. So perceptions of childhood are related to adult mood state. Direct objective measures, blows being struck, hitting with objects, those correlate with directly observed behavior. Perceptions of one's childhood, referring to it as harsh, uncompromising, unpleasant, those perceptive aspects are correlated with current mood state, and current mood state does not predict the objective measures. So we've got, and I got to watch my time here. So we have a number of different sets of data where the self-reports of childhood experiences provide useful data in both clinical and non-clinical samples about the childhood histories, but not descriptions of whether or not you characterize that experience as abusive. Now let me switch to target influences, because this has been an interest of mine for a long time. And I'm not talking about victim blaming, but when we think of aggressive behavior and child abuse, they're both dyadic. The target is not a passive manipulandum. The target responds to the initiated overtures of aggression and abuse. Now, in non-human work, we used to distinguish between suitable and non-suitable targets. Anesthetized targets were not suitable. One of the critical things is the role of reciprocity, so that when parents engage in disciplinary acts, children respond. So there is a reciprocated response that goes between the child and the parent. One of the things that the late Trish Sullivan and I were very interested in was whether or not we could identify victim risk factors and the link between abuse and disabilities. And we proposed that in a number of different studies and a number of think pieces looking at relatively small samples. So we then decided that the real problem was power. So one of the first studies that we did, we merged all of the Boys Town National Research Hospital records with 3 databases that provide information about child maltreatment in the state of Nebraska. The Nebraska Department of Social Services Central Registry data, the Foster Care Review Board, which covers kids who are in out-of-home placements, and then police agencies that were within the catchment area. So that would have been Sarpy County, Lancaster County, and the metropolitan area of Omaha. From within those samples, we selected 6,833 children that had been maltreated that were in the Boys Town hospital records. And then from that, we selected subsamples from the Nebraska Department of Social Service, the police records, foster care review board. We pulled out 880 control kids. And we also separated the residents from Father Flanagan's boys' home because those tended to be a different population of children. For those of you who remember the Mickey Rooney movie, that's Father Flanagan's boys' home. What we found with the large sample size is there was a strong association between disability status and having been maltreated. And it didn't matter what the disability. So we had hearing impaired children, we had developmental disabilities, we had motoric disabilities. The only sample that was roughly comparable to non-disabled children was the relatively small sample of autistic kids that we had in that study. We then replicated this in a school-based study. We took all of the children who were enrolled in the public schools and the archdiocese schools in Omaha in the 94-95 school year. And again, we merged those records, all of the school records, 40,000 kids, with the abuse records, foster care review board, the Nebraska Department of Social Service, and the appropriate law enforcement agencies from the catchment area. And then there were 3,500 kids that had no record of child maltreatment. So we had a non-duplicated maltreatment sample because a lot of the kids would be represented in multiple settings and multiple agencies. So we had 4,500 maltreated kids and 3,500 control kids from whom we could examine the link between disabilities and maltreatment. And based on a population-based study, data are consistent with the fact that disabilities serve as a significant risk factor for physical abuse and neglect and sexual abuse. But I was mostly interested in our consideration of physical abuse in the context of this talk. The data are also consistent with maltreatment increases the risk of the development of behavior disorders, primarily antisocial behavior in children within that sample. So for a subgroup of kids where we could identify antecedent events of abuse and subsequent disabilities, and these are again educationally based disability records, we could show that the maltreatment increases the risk for the emergence of behavior problems, and the disabilities occasion risk for the maltreatment. One of the last studies we did related to parents of deaf children. Again, I've been mostly interested in, it's very hard to do prospective studies where the antecedent event is clearly preceding the occurrence of some of the abuse events. So I was able to get the parents, mothers, of 57 consecutively referred prelingually deafened pediatric cochlear implant children. So these are children who either were congenitally deafened or had an adventitious event that occurred prior to the onset of language. And then they were all seeking a cochlear implant at the University of Iowa. And at that time, Boys Town National Research Hospital was not doing cochlear implants. So I was able to recruit 22 prelingual parents of 22 prelingually deafened children who were not seeking a cochlear implant. And then we recruited 27 normally hearing children who were age matched to the children in the deaf sample, who were just showing up looking for participation in studies of spatial reasoning. And the mother's rating of the children on the Achenbach Child Behavior Checklist suggested that the groups were rather normal looking children and no significant differences among groups according to their mothers. If anything, the implant mothers saw very little internalizing behavior in their children. And the parents participated in an analog parenting task in which they viewed 28 slides depicting children engaged in both deviant and non-deviant behavior. They were either dangerous scenes, destructive scenes, normative scenes that you would expect from the age of the child depicted, or rule violating. Children consuming alcohol, smoking. Anyway, the parents, the task is for them to select a disciplinary strategy if they were charged with the responsibility of caring for that child. So they either select a physical discipline task, they don't have to, but if they do, that's one of our dependent measures, or they escalate. If they are asked to respond to the child, if the child continues to display the depicted behavior, if they shift from a non-physical response to a physical response, or if they shift from a non-injurious discipline to a potentially injurious discipline. So we have two dependent measures, the physical discipline and the escalation. So the mean physical discipline scores, the parents of deaf children were far more likely to select physical discipline in response to the depicted children's behavior. They were more likely to respond to dangerous and destructive acts, and somewhat less to the rule violating. And they also escalated more. So this study showed that mothers of a deaf child are more likely to embrace the use of physical and potentially injurious physical discipline. Now, some of those mothers had normal hearing children in their household as well. So the presence of the profoundly deafened child increased the risk of physical abuse or physical discipline. And it's quite consistent with some early studies that Trish Sullivan and I did in the very early Schlesinger and Meadow studies at the University of Chicago in the early 70s. So the findings that we have suggest that physical discipline is family specific rather than child specific. One of the studies that I did with Libby Whitmore and John Kramer some years ago, we looked at ADHD adults. They were identified as ADHD, and we contrasted them with their non-ADHD peers from classroom matching. And we showed that the pattern of behavior was household specific rather than child specific. One of the other things that I thought was important is that there was no difference between parents of implant candidates and parents of children who were choosing not to seek a cochlear implant. So I think I'm going to end up on time. So let me close with a few things. One of them is I think self-report measures work fine and study aggression and child abuse, but they have to be based on objective events rather than perceptions of events. I have long said that the really dumb question is to ask somebody if they were physically abused as a child, because virtually nobody will acknowledge that, even if they come from remarkably punitive experience. So research subjects might not view their world the same way we view their experiences in their world. And I'm particularly interested in the fact that abuse risk is significantly associated with the presence of disabilities. And that causes us to think about how we might need to pursue altered considerations of the dyadic aspects of parenting and the dyadic aspects of abuse and aggression within the household.